This video will work through problem 6.5 from Gapenski's Healthcare Finance 6th edition. Okay, in 6.5, we're going to introduce now doing step down. And I want to take a second to kind of review what that means. So in 6.3 and 4, we assumed we had we're still working with the same hospitals. We had general administration, facilities, and financial services. And then we had 4 activities. We had routine care, intensive care, diagnostics, and other. And when we did direct allocation, what we would do is we would say, okay, let's take general administration, figure out what their cost pool is, figure out what the driver was, and then we carve up general administration directly to the supported departments. And then once all of the general administration was allocated, it basically disappears. Then we would go down to facilities. We would do the same thing. We would calculate what the cost pool was for facilities. We would figure out what the cost driver was supposed to be, and then we would allocate based on the allocation rate. And so all the facilities would get carved up. So these are our cost centers. These are our profit centers, right? So all of the cost from facilities would get carved up, and then there would be nothing left over here. And then finally, financial services, we would calculate the cost pool, figure out what the cost driver was, calculate the allocation rate, and then allocate financial services to the supported departments. And then that would be gone. There was never at any point in time any consideration of the relationship between the cost centers. So now under step down method, what we're going to do is we are going to assume that the cost centers both support the profit centers as well as support each other. Now, if we were going to do full reciprocal, we would consider a relationship between each of the support centers as well as their relationship with the cost centers. We're going to do step down. So what we're going to assume is sort of a hierarchy of support. And order matters. So we're going to assume general administration provides support to all of the profit centers, but it also provides support to facilities and financial services. So when we go to allocate general administration, we'll calculate its cost pool, just like always. We'll calculate the cost driver. So let's see, the cost driver is going to be salary dollars like it was in 6.4. So general administration allocation is going to be salary dollars. So it's still going to be same theoretical cost driver. But when we go to calculate the denominator, the actual amount of salary dollars to put into the cost driver for general administration, under direct, we would have only counted the salaries from the profit centers. When we go to do the allocation under step down, we'll count all the salaries from the profit centers plus any remaining cost centers. So in this case, it'll be facilities and financial services. So the cost driver will be the sum of the salaries from the profit center plus the salaries from facilities plus the salaries from financial services. So it's going to make a bigger cost driver than before. Okay, so once we figure out that allows us to get our allocation rate, and then we start allocating general administration like before to the respective profit centers, but we also allocate a little bit of general administration to facilities and a little bit of general administration to financial services. So then general administration is gone, it's off the table. Next, we go to do the allocate facilities. Well, when we go to calculate the cost pool for facilities now, it's not going to just be the direct costs for facilities. It's going to be the direct cost for facilities, which were $5 million, plus whatever got allocated to it during the first round of step down for general administration. So some amount of money got passed down to facilities from general administration. That winds up getting added to the direct costs of facilities to increase the cost pool associated with facilities. That then gets divided by the new cost driver. So facilities is going to be housekeeping hours. So we're basically using the same drivers as we used in 6.4. So we're going to use the housekeeping hours for all of the profit centers plus the housekeeping officers for financial services to form the denominator that we use for the cost driver. We use that increased cost driver amount and the increased cost pool. So we divide the increased cost pool by the increased cost driver to come up with a new allocation rate. And then we allocate facilities like before to the profit centers. But we also allocate a little bit of facilities to financial services. And then facilities is gone. So now financial services, we go to calculate the cost pool for financial services is the direct costs for financial services plus a little bit of general administration plus a little bit of facilities to create the cost pool for financial services. So financial services cost pool is not just its direct costs, it's also the share of general administration that got passed down to it and the share of facilities that got passed down to it. So then that gets allocated to each of the profit centers just like before. And now all of the cost centers have been allocated, so therefore all of the overhead costs have been allocated. The end result is still going to be, in this case, allocating $10 million in costs, right? Or whatever the total of these was. It doesn't change the total amount allocated, but it's going to have some effect on how that $10 million gets allocated across the four profit centers. All right, so that's the theory. Let's see it done now in Excel. Okay, so here we are back in Excel. And we're going to start the process by identifying, so remember, same 4 steps, they're just done a little bit differently. So step 1, identify the cost pool. Okay, so the cost pool for general administration, because it's the first of the cost centers to be allocated, is just going to be its own direct cost, okay? The big difference for general administration is going to be what we put into the cost driver. So the cost driver is going to be salaries, but this time it's not going to just be the $30 million in salaries. It's going to be the $30 million in salaries for the supported profit centers, plus it's going to be the salaries for facilities, plus it's going to be the salaries for the financial services. Now notice I'm not counting general administration's salary, so be careful not to do that, right? Because we're allocating general administration, we don't need to add their salaries in, or that'll throw off the calculation. So the cost driver this time, instead of being the 30 million, is actually going to be 35 million. So the allocation rate is the cost pool divided by the cost driver. And so we get 6 cents per. So 6 cents per dollar of salaries. So we'll now allocate general administration to routine care. So it's going to be 6 cents per dollar of salaries times 12 million for routine care, 6 cents per dollar of salaries times $5 million for intensive care. Why is it doing that? Times $5 million for intensive care. There we go. 6 cents per dollar times 6 million for diagnostics. And then finally, 6 cents per dollar of salaries times 7 million in salaries. Now, in the past, we've been able to add up the row for each of the 4 profit centers and wound up with the equal to the cost pool. That's not going to happen anymore. Well, not this time, because we're not done allocating general administration yet. We've also got to allocate a portion of general administration to facilities and to financial services. So the cost pool for facilities is going to be 5 million in direct costs plus 6 cents per dollar of salaries times the 3 million in salaries for facilities. So the cost pool for facilities is going to be 5.17 million because it's being increased by 171,000 for facilities' share of general administration's costs. Okay. Next, we calculate the cost driver. And remember, the cost driver for facilities is housekeeping hours. So that's going to be all of the housekeeping hours for the profit centers, which is 220,000, right? So it's the sum of all these, plus it's going to be the housekeeping hours for financial services, 3,000. And so now we get our allocation rate is going to be the cost pool divided by the cost driver, an allocation rate of 2319. Now we can allocate the facilities costs to our profit centers. So routine care gets $23.19 per hour times number of hours, 150,000. Intensive care gets $23.19 per hour times 30,000 hours. Diagnostics gets $23.19 per hour times 15,000 hours. And then other gets $23.19 per hour times 25,000 hours. And we get 5.101, which does not quite add up to the cost pool because we also have to allocate facilities costs to financial services. So let's calculate the cost pool for financial services now. The cost pool for financial services is going to be equal to 3 million in direct costs plus 6 cents per dollar of salaries plus $23.19 per hour of housekeeping. And so the cost pool for financial services is 3,183,857. The cost driver for financial services is revenues, which means that we're only going to draw from the profit centers, as we did before. On top of that, it's the last cost center to be allocated, so there are no other cost centers for financial services to be allocated to. So if there was a fourth cost center, then financial services would be further stepped down to that cost center, because since there are no more left, this is essentially going to function like the direct method. So now we get the allocation rate. It's going to be the 3.1 million divided by 50 million, and we get approximately 6 cents of financial services expense per dollar of revenue. Now, something to be careful with, if you're doing this in a calculator and it rounds, to 6 cents, that really is, 6.437. That actually matters a lot when you're multiplying by big numbers like 30 million. Okay. So you've got to be careful with that, or you're going to wind up with pretty significant rounding errors down here, and things are not going to add up. So that's just kind of have some caution with that. I would recommend using as many decimals as you can to get the most accuracy, particularly when you're multiplying a small number like 0.06 times a big number like revenue, like 30 million, right? So we're going to take that 6 cents per dollar of revenue times 30 million, 6 cents in revenue times 4 million in revenue, 6 cents per dollar of revenue times 6 million in revenue, 6 cents per dollar of revenue times 10 million in revenue, and we get 3.83 million. Okay. So we couldn't previously add across these rows because some of these costs, so some of the costs of general administration, was getting handed over to facilities and as well as to financial services. But when we add up the totals and then add up the totals, it still comes out to 10 million, which is equal to the direct costs of the cost centers. The allocation is just a little bit different, right? So that's what I said when I was showing the visual that I did before we started working. All right, so let's see, so that's 6.5A. 6.5B says compare the dollar allocations with those obtained in problem 6.4. So 6.5 and 6.4 use the same cost drivers, right? So we said we used for general administration, we used salary dollars. For facilities, we used housekeeping hours, and for financial services, we used revenues. So let's go over there and grab the outcomes from 6.4. So we can make a comparison. All right. So how did it come out? How did things come out differently? Well, here's something to note. We used the same drivers, right? But we wound up with fairly significant differences between each of the rows here, right? So routine care, general administration, 685 under step down, 800 under direct, even using the same drivers. So there's some fairly significant differences across the board. Looking for big changes, and I'm not seeing anything really dramatic. A quick way to do this would be to do a percent change. So let's do that real quick. So how much more is general administration for routine care? So let's do that. 685. We're going to do new minus old divided by old. And so we had a 14% decrease. So let's just do that across the board. So going from 6.4 to 6.5, for routine care, general administration costs were reduced across the board by 14%, 2% for increases for facilities, and a 6% increase in financial services. So this is the same. These are the same percent changes all the way down. And so what we're really finding is, what this really shows is that general administration was allocated to the other departments. So that makes sense. Let me just add one more line. So we see relatively small changes in total overhead allocation, 1%, 2%, 3%. These are not huge numbers. So how much impact does it have? It's probably a little more accurate because what it does is it puts, it shows or it captures the relationships between the support departments. And then, in theory, it recognizes those relationships, but at the same time, we're capturing a relatively small overall shift, right? So ignore the 14% change in general admin because that just gets pushed down. The overall shift is relatively small. And of course, it's at the end of the day, the 10 million at the organization level doesn't change. 10 million is still 10 million. How it's allocated does matter, of course, to the managers, but how much, but the change going from direct to step down does not result in that much of a reallocation as did the changes when we went from 6.3 to 6.4 and came up with what I would argue were more accurate drivers. So really, the step down is probably a little more accurate, but the question becomes, is it worth the time and effort to do it? Given that it's probably being done electronically, it probably doesn't matter that much. So, again, this is a cost-benefit analysis. It could go one way or the other. I think the main lesson from these three problems, from 6.3, 6.4, and 6.5, is that getting the right driver or a more accurate driver is more important than whether you do direct or step down.